Okay. I am here to talk about a plant. It is one that has been hitting the airwaves since time immemorial. But the question is, what is this plant? Where did it even come from? And how come it has managed to stand the test of time, establishing itself as a renowned staple around the country? There are very many assumptions that are raised as to when the banana was introduced to the East African coast. Some historical and agronomical scholars believe the banana was introduced about 4,500 years ago to the East African coast, while others believe it was introduced about 2,000 years ago. But the major assumption that has garnered majority consent and public opinion of most of the historical and agronomical scholars instigates that the coming of the banana to the East African coast was instigated by a foreign people. Sailing on their big ships, which were facilitated by the strong monsoon winds, the Arabs soared high and low on the continental waters of Africa until they landed on the East African coast.
Alright, so most of the factors were internal, started from their homeland. There was a lot of religious persecution, and then the tribal divisions that came in forced most of them outside. And so they were looking for a new place to go in that they could domineer, and the East African coast was the very first destination, especially because of the monsoon winds.
The story of the Arabs at the East African coast is mostly a story of Islamism, how they managed to bring a new religion that transformed the entire coastal areas, establishing a new religion in Islam, which perhaps managed to be a doctrine of the many that lived at the coastal areas, and suppressing the Christianity that had been brought into place by the Portuguese. It's also a story of the unbated exploitation of Africa's resources, and the greatest African resource at the time that was being exploited was us, human beings.
These people were enslaved Africans, and their lives on board the slave ships were filled with pain, suffering, and death.
They operated a very lucrative slave trade business on the coastal towns of Kilwa, Pemba, and then the island of Zanzibar, and they also dealt in other merchandise such as ivory, silver, among its other precious stones and gems that were found within the land of Africa. The story of the Arabs at the East African coast, it's also a story of Said, this man who transferred his capital all the way from Muscat in Oman to Zanzibar at the East African coast to establish large plantations of cloves, which by then had a very big crossing market around the world.
Zanzibar is the greatest exporter of cloves, which form her staple produce and are exported in bulk to the world's kitchens. But local housewives too take advantage of the abundance of all things nice which grow around them.
But very little is talked of the Arabs and the introduction of the banana. But here's how it makes sense. The word banana comes from the Arab word banan, which means a finger. It is this that instigated the Arabs to add an A at the end of banan, making it banana. Interestingly, a cluster of banana is also known as a hand, which has specific fingers. This name banana has stuck even up today and is recognized by some of the world's leading dictionaries. I think someone is pondering on a question. Oman and pretty much the rest of the Arab Peninsula is mostly a dry and deserted desert area, especially those days in the 16 and 1700 when there was little to minimal technology. So how come these groupings of people, why did they actually manage to get the banana in the first place? Could it have grown in that very desert? So when the Arabs came to the African coast, they first visited the eastern coast in the present-day New Guinea, and while there they noticed a plant. a plant that flourished so much amongst the tropicals. And because they were visiting other areas on the African coast, particularly the East African coast, they decided to take the plant with them, basing on the New Guinea legacy that saw them get large stretches of uncultivated and unexplored land. And so they did, bringing the plant to the East African coast. So through the trade routes that existed at the time, this plant found its way into mainland Uganda.
There was a trade route that came from the Chaga kingdom the Chaga chiefdom in Tanzania to Buganda. There was another one that came from Kenya through to Buganda, because the Baganda kings back then were so interested in trade with the slaves, because they liked guns and the rest. So this crop easily found itself to Uganda. But what kept it here was the good climatic conditions, because this area receives good climate because of Lake Victoria. It's well vegetated. Look at Mabira Forest. So the convectional climate enabled the plant to flourish.
So we have talked about the introduction of this crop, this ensuing staple that feeds millions. But it's about time we narrow the scope. Uganda.